No one is an island unto themselves. What that means is simply that we can't do it ourselves. There are so many people throughout our lives who have influenced who we are right now. Some of these people we are not aware of anymore, or may have never been aware of. But there are some who haven't done very much, but they have made us who we are. And then there are the important ones. One of those, for me, was a person called Ruthie. She had Down syndrome. And when I was told that I was going to meet her, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to or not. I'd never been around anyone like that. And I must say that even though I was a strapping 20-some-year-old person, I was afraid. Now, that shouldn't surprise you. Because when there's something different, or a person is different, sometimes we are afraid. We try to ignore the person, or just think they don't exist. But you know something? I learned a great deal from Ruthie. Yes, she did have Down syndrome. But I learned important lessons that have stuck with me for the rest of my life. I found that I didn't need to be afraid. I learned about disabilities in a way I hadn't before. And I learned about unconditional love that she had, and trust. Then I began to look at life in a different way than I had before. And I was thankful. Not just thankful that I didn't have Down syndrome, but thankful for life itself. And there was another lesson I learned, and it was this. What is normal? I had to ask that question. I had been around what I thought were normal people. And that's what I thought was normal. But then I met Ruthie and a whole bunch of people throughout my life. And I realized that everybody really has a disability in one way or another. They may be what we call normal now, but now they can't hear or see or walk or be without pain or sickness. And that brings us to our passage from Luke chapter 13, verses 10 to 17. And it tells us about a woman who came into a synagogue or a church. She was very crippled, and Jesus reached out and touched her. And we learn four things. We learn about being crippled, compassion, being critical, and the new normal. So this one woman was crippled. Now, we see people like that. They have hunched back. They can hardly move. We see other people who are crippled with fear or guilt or something in the past. Maybe it was sickness itself. We know what it means to have a disability. Jesus did too. The only difference was he was able to do something about it, and he did. So can you imagine this woman coming into the synagogue, shuffling her feet, head down, shoulders hunched, and every step that she took was a step of pain. Everybody knew that she couldn't do what she used to be able to do. She couldn't maintain a friendship very well. She had to have other people help her. She couldn't sleep at night because of the pain. She couldn't walk and move around. And she couldn't really work. And that person, that woman, was likely depressed at times. That happens when you look to the future and you see nothing getting better, and you can get down on yourself and you say, I don't know whether I can do it or not. Why is God allowing me to go through this? And so those people who were sitting in the pews must have asked the question, why? Why is she like she is? As I said last week, people were saying that if somebody had a disability or go through a rough time, it was their fault, they had done some sin. But that's not the way it is. It could be. And sometimes when we sin, we need to get the consequences. But in this case, no. In fact, the reason Jesus said was because of the devil, an evil spirit, made her the way she was. Now, in our day and age, this really doesn't cut the cheese. Because most of us, hopefully not us, believe that the universe is the only reality there is. There's no supernatural, there's no God, there's no nothing beyond what we can see and feel and touch. And we must remember the person who wrote this was the most reliable historian of the ancient world. It was Luke, and he was a doctor. And now he didn't have all the knowledge that doctors have today, nor all the tools to use to diagnose things. But he knew that there was something evil that was happening here. Once I worked as a security guard at 999 Queen Street West in Toronto. That's a mental hospital. And most of the doctors and the nurses realize that there's something called evil. They talked to me about it. And this is what the word said. But you know, when you think about being crippled, when you think of someone having disabilities when it comes to us spiritually, we can be crippled, can't we? We can be crippled with fear, guilt, sin. But that's not the whole story, is it? Because there's compassion. Now, when this woman walked into that synagogue, she probably didn't have any hope. She had hope of worshiping God, because Jesus said she was a daughter of Abraham. In other words, she had faith. But she didn't think anything was going to happen that day. But Jesus, what our scripture says, that Jesus saw her, and he called her to the front, and he said to her, "Woman, you are free from your infirmities." And something happened. All of a sudden, she could straighten up. The pain went away. And what can we learn? First of all, Jesus looked at her. How many times have we tried to ignore someone that's different? Someone who has a disability. Someone who we're not quite sure of. But when Jesus looked, he saw her, she knew what she was going through, and he saw her in love and compassion and mercy and grace. In other words, he accepted her. And then he said something that must have confused people. He asked her to walk to the front of the synagogue. And can you imagine how difficult that must have been for that woman? She had just got into the synagogue, most likely, and she was resting, and she needed that rest. But Jesus said, come up to the front. Why did he do that? He wanted people to know without a doubt how she really was. How crippled she was. And then we are told a very wonderful thing. We are told that Jesus touched her. You know how powerful touch is? People need touch. Some of the communist countries, the Balkans, they had orphanages, and they never touched that child or those children. And those children absolutely were all messed up. And anybody who was used to touch from a spouse and no longer has it, they miss it. And Jesus broke all the rules and regulations. He wasn't supposed to touch a woman, but he did. And he made her whole. And he's willing to touch us as well. With his forgiveness, with his healing. We may not receive healing today, as long as we live on this earth, but someday we will. We'll have new bodies. And they will be perfect. But then there's the critic. Don't you just love the critics? There's always a critic in the crowd. Have you ever noticed that? Things can be going well, people can have a good time, but there's always that solemn person who makes some comment that just throws everything out of sync. And who was this person? You would have thought it would have been one of the members of the congregation maybe who hadn't come very often or knew this woman and knew what she had done in the past. But it was the synagogue ruler. And he should have been excited about what happened on that Sabbath day. But he wasn't. But did he tell Jesus? Well, he did, but in an indirect way. And some people do that. And how he told them was, you can be healed anytime, but not on the Sabbath. And he told all the other people. Now my question is, if this is a parishioner of his, wouldn't he have been happy and excited about this person being healed? Wouldn't he have been absolutely elated that she had no more pain? So why in the world did he say, you can be healed, but not on the Sabbath? It's because of how he thought and saw things. He was very rigid. And he said, the Sabbath says you're not to work on the Sabbath, you're not to heal on the Sabbath. And in a sense, he was correct. Wasn't he? If we go to the Ten Commandments, it says, your oxen, your donkey, your maidservants, and your manservants aren't to work on the Sabbath, and neither are you. And Jesus' response to it was simply this: you hypocrites, you untie your ox and your donkey from the stalls and you lead them out to water them. Should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, in other words, a godly person, who has been bound by a spirit for 18 years, shouldn't she be free from her bondage? In other words, have compassion, have grace, have mercy. Yes, you're not to work on the Sabbath, but you're also to have mercy on the Sabbath. That's one of the reasons God has given you a time of rest, so you can reach out. We must. It's very easy to be critical of this synagogue ruler. But we must realize as well that we sometimes have our rules and we have our regulations. And we try, and when people don't follow them, we're condemning. But we must remember what Jesus says. He simply says, be merciful. And then he talks about the new normal. We live in this earth, and we think this is normal. But it isn't. God didn't create this world and create us to live like we do with all the suffering and pain. And he's given us a Sabbath or a Sunday. And he's saying that we are to rest, that we are to come to worship and give God his true worth, but we're also to do acts of mercy and compassion. 100 years ago, people worked 6 days a week. And then on Sunday, they went to worship. But they also did acts of mercy. And that's what Jesus is telling us. He's telling us that we can't just focus in on ourselves. There are others out there who need a hug. They need compassion. They need grace. They need mercy. And the people there, some were humiliated, but others rejoiced in God's goodness because they knew what Jesus was saying and what Jesus had showed them. And it was simply this. We always need to show mercy and grace. They saw it in front of their eyes, a crippled up woman who was in agonizing pain, restored to wholeness. And we have a new normal. We don't have it on this earth, but we will. Someday, the earth will be destroyed by fire. A new heaven and earth will be created. And there will be a resurrection. And we who believe in Jesus will have our bodies resurrected from the grave, and they will be perfect. Stephanie Hubach wrote an article in the magazine By Faith in 2005, in the April-March edition of page 35. And she talks about one of her friends who had a son with disabilities, and he died. She went to the funeral, and she was really upset, even after the funeral service was over. And so she went into another room and she wept. When she came out, she was noticed by a man with disabilities. And he confronted her and said, "Do you love Jesus?" Now, the last thing she wanted to do was to talk to someone with Down syndrome. And she walked past him, but he kept following her. And he said to her, "Ben, that was the one who died. Ben loved Jesus. He's now grown up." And she ignored him again, muttered a few words, walked away from him, and he followed her, waving his arms, almost yelling at her, getting in front of her again, looking her right in the eyes and said, "Ben loves Jesus." She walked away, and he said, "And he can now walk." And then he said, and Ben can see Jesus. We live in a broken world. We have broken lives. Sometimes we're sin weary. Other times we're just weary physically. And we battle each day some of our disabilities. But a new day is coming, when all the abnormal stuff on this earth will be gone. And it will be a new day, when we will be perfect before God. But He's here right now. So reach out to Him and touch Him by faith and see what He has in store for you.